Hello everyone. Today we're diving into a tense and thrilling sci-fi horror film, The Fly, a movie filled with shocking moments, so watch with caution. At a party, scientist Seth instantly fell for a beautiful journalist named Veronica, and he told her that his research could change the world. But Veronica, who had met countless people, thought his way of flirting was way too cliché. To prove that his words were true, Seth invited Veronica to visit his secret laboratory. It was a rundown building on the outside, but inside it hid something extraordinary. When he opened the sealed door, two strange machines stood in the middle of the lab, connected to a computer with a web of complicated cables. Then he asked Veronica for a personal item, so she took off her high heel and slipped off the black stocking from her leg. Seth placed the stocking inside the transmitter pod, then started the program on his computer. As lines of code flashed across the screen, a miracle unfolded. Looking at the now empty transmitter pod, Veronica thought its purpose was to destroy objects, but the program displayed the words, "Teleportation successful." Seth pulled Veronica over to the receiver pod, and there her stocking had reappeared, perfectly intact. It turned out that Seth's invention could teleport objects across space using the principle of disassembly and reassembly. Inside the transmitter pod, objects were broken down into microscopic particles, and with the help of his computer, they were reconstructed in the receiver pod. Veronica was thrilled, thinking if she reported this, it would be the kind of groundbreaking news that could shock the world. She quickly switched on her recorder and began interviewing him, but Seth asked her not to make it public. Still, Veronica wanted the scoop, so she took the tape back to her editor. Stathis listened to the recording and concluded that Veronica must have been deceived, thinking Seth had only made up the story to win her over. But before he finished talking, Seth showed up at the office. Soon after, Seth and Veronica went out for dinner. Seth told her that even though he invented the telepods, if word got out, the group backing him would want to silence him, and even fellow scientists wouldn't tolerate it, because his research wasn't complete yet. So far, he could only teleport non-living objects. If a living being entered the transmitter pod, it would turn into something unrecognizable, like ground-up meat. But if Veronica promised to keep it secret, he would let her document his experiments step by step. For such an exclusive story, Veronica agreed. Later, Stathis investigated Seth's background and discovered he had once led a research team that nearly won the Nobel Prize in physics. Even more shocking, Seth was only 20 years old at the time, a true genius, without a doubt. This made Veronica even more fascinated by him. She returned to Seth's lab with her camera, documenting everything on a daily basis. One day, Seth decided to try teleporting a baboon, and when the countdown ended, the animal inside the transmitter pod was successfully broken down. But when the receiver pod opened, the sight was horrifying, and Seth realized something had gone wrong with his program. The computer had rebuilt the baboon inside out, so its body was nothing but raw tissue. The failed experiment left Seth devastated, and Veronica stayed behind to comfort him, and the two of them shared a tender night together. But during their time together, Seth's back was scratched by a chip. Since it was only a small cut, they didn't pay much attention to it. Afterward, in the heat of inspiration, Seth figured out why the experiment had failed. To test his idea, he placed a steak inside the transmitter pod. The reconstructed steak turned out tasting more like artificial meat. The truth was that the computer was only rearranging raw material, not truly recreating the steak, which was why living creatures couldn't survive the process. Finding the root of the problem, Seth worked overnight to update the program, then placed another baboon into the transmitter pod. After a flash of energy, the receiver pod door opened and the baboon jumped out, alive and healthy. Seth had finally succeeded in teleporting a living creature. Next, he planned to send the new baboon for tests, which might take weeks or even months. But Veronica suggested he take a break, since they hadn't really enjoyed time together since becoming a couple. Seth, smitten with love, instantly changed his mind, even planning a candlelight dinner for that evening. But just as he was ordering food, Veronica suddenly changed her mind. On Seth's desk, she had found a letter from her office containing an unpublished report about the teleportation experiments, and the lead writer was none other than Stathis. Worried that this report would cause trouble for Seth and afraid that the scoop she had worked so hard to uncover would be stolen, Veronica rushed back to deal with it. Stathis seemed to have expected her return, and with a sly smile, he reminded her that he was the one who had sent her to the party in the first place, so the discovery should belong to him. And if she wanted him to hold back from publishing the report, she would have to agree to one of his conditions.
As a friend? As a professional confidant?
That's all.
I don't want you to disappear from my life.
Hearing such a simple request, Veronica agreed without hesitation. But just as she was about to leave, Stathis brazenly made an even more outrageous demand.
Yeah, I'm not saying love or affection, just stress-relieving sex. You and me.
In fact, Stathis was Veronica's ex-boyfriend, and he had always hoped to rekindle their relationship, but each time she rejected him coldly, and this time was no different. Meanwhile, in the laboratory, Seth had no idea what was happening. He was left waiting in confusion, growing jealous and restless, imagining that Veronica's late-night meeting with Stathis must involve something unspeakable. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't even notice when a fly slipped into the lab. Driven by unstable emotions, his ideas grew reckless, and he decided to use himself as the subject of the teleportation experiment. He set the timer, stripped completely, and stepped into the transmitter pod. But in the very last second before the door closed, that fly flew in with him. Focused on the countdown, Seth didn't realize what had happened. The baboon tried to warn him, but it couldn't speak. It could only watch helplessly as Seth was teleported away. When Seth stepped out of the receiver pod, he looked unchanged, but the fly was nowhere to be found. When Veronica, drained and exhausted, finally returned to the lab, she found that Seth, who was once rational, was now completely overtaken by desire. They had only been apart for a few hours, yet the moment they touched it was like fire to dry wood, and by morning Veronica had collapsed into sleep. But Seth was still full of energy, effortlessly performing difficult gymnastics moves that he could never have done before. He believed this change was because the computer had optimized his body during the reassembly process. Seeing Seth's excitement and his strange behavior, Veronica couldn't help but feel worried. Later that afternoon, she discovered that the wound on Seth's back had sprouted coarse, bristly hair, something no human should have. She quickly trimmed it with scissors, but Seth didn't care. Instead, he criticized Veronica's lack of stamina. Every time they were together, her weaker body could never satisfy his new intensity. To solve their difference, Seth suggested Veronica use the transmitter pod to optimize her own body, but she was too frightened and refused. Unexpectedly, Seth grew annoyed with Veronica because of this. He put on his clothes and left, not forgetting to mock Veronica for her short-sightedness before going. Afterward, he went to a nightclub where an arm wrestling contest was being held, with the prize being a night with a woman named Tawny. Seth joined without hesitation. Everyone in the club was watching, convinced that a guy like Seth, who loved sweets, could never defeat the arm wrestling champion. While others were arm wrestling, Seth was strong enough to snap the opponent's arm. Though the scene was gruesome, Tawny still chose to leave with him. They went back to the laboratory together, and Seth even carried Tawny in his arms all the way to the top floor. Neither of them noticed the strange liquid trickling down the staircase. Before being with Tawny, Seth once again stepped into the transmitter pod to enhance himself, and then they spent the whole night together in wild abandon. Yet even Tawny, who was usually very bold, was surprised that she couldn't satisfy Seth. Seth then wanted Tawny to try the transmitter pod as well, but as they argued, Veronica appeared. She had taken samples of the hair from Seth's back to experts, who confirmed it was not human at all, but most likely belonged to an insect. Now, Seth not only had more of those strange hairs on his back, but his once handsome face was also covered with unusual spots. Veronica suspected something had gone wrong with his experiment and urged him to check, but he threw her out of the lab. However, when Seth was alone, he did start to re-examine his own body. Unexpectedly, when he habitually bit his finger while thinking, his fingernail suddenly fell off. When he pressed lightly on the exposed spot, a strange fluid actually sprayed out. Such horrifying changes finally made Seth regain a trace of rational thought. He hurried to the computer and pulled up the data from his first teleportation. But when he was giving voice input, his voice suddenly sounded strange for a moment, and before he could reflect on it, he was shocked speechless by the data on the screen. The computer had analyzed not just Seth, but also the fly inside the transmitter pod during that teleportation. Because it couldn't separate living organisms, Seth's particles and the fly's particles fused at the genetic level, creating the new version of Seth. After learning the truth, he hid outside for a month, quietly enduring the cruel consequences of teleportation. But in the end, he couldn't handle it alone. And one day, he reached out to Veronica for help. When Veronica rushed to see him, she found that his condition was already dire. His body was changing every day, and it was only getting worse. Seth apologized to Veronica for mocking her before. He had not optimized his body through the telepods, but instead, because of his careless operation, he had become a fusion of human and fly. Now his cells were mutating like a cancer, and before long, the human Seth would be gone forever. Veronica didn't want him to lose his humanity completely, so she tried to find someone else to help. But Seth refused. Terrified of becoming a specimen and unwilling to be the subject of gossip, he firmly rejected her offer. To ease the tense atmosphere, he tried to act casual, but when he attempted to eat, a disgusting fluid spilled out of his mouth, and when he touched his ear, it suddenly fell off his body. Veronica quickly held Seth tightly. telling him not to be afraid of his current situation. Afterward, Veronica discussed the matter with Stathis, but Stathis suggested that she should never go back to Seth again. Yet, under Veronica's insistence, Stathis finally agreed to help, but on the condition that Veronica record Seth's current life. So Veronica returned to the laboratory once more, where Seth had already mutated to the point he could crawl on walls and ceilings. Although his appearance had grown hideous, he insisted that he would not infect anyone, only that he was becoming a creature the world had never seen before, most likely a 168-pound man-fly. Then, he sat in front of the camera to demonstrate how he ate. Unlike human chewing and digestion, his teeth were useless now. Swallowing solid food was like torture for him. So he adopted the fly's method, secreting a corrosive enzyme to dissolve food, then sucking the liquefied matter into his stomach. However, after watching the recording, Stathis still could not find any solution. At that moment, Veronica cried and locked herself in the bathroom.
I'm pregnant with Seth's baby.
She and Stathis hurried to the hospital, and on the operating table, the doctor asked Veronica to relax but push hard to deliver what was inside her.
Come on, push. That's it. Come on, come on.
No, wait. No.
It turned out that the scene of childbirth was only a nightmare. Elsewhere, Seth tried to erase the fly genes from his body, but his fingers were no longer flexible enough to input commands. He tried voice commands, but the computer could not recognize his speech and told him to switch to manual input. This frustrated Seth greatly, and in the process his teeth fell out one by one, though he remained eerily calm. Gathering the fallen teeth, he walked to the bathroom mirror and placed them in the medicine cabinet behind it. Inside, he had already stored other body parts that had dropped off, some of them very important. At this time, Veronica slowly entered, wanting to tell Seth she was pregnant. But when she saw her boyfriend turning into a monster, no longer fully human, she could not bring herself to say it. Seth, on the other hand, poured out a string of words, which made Veronica's skin crawl. Even though they were unwilling in their hearts, the cruelty of reality forced them to part. Later, Veronica reunited with Stathis downstairs and asked him to take her to the hospital for an abortion. But as they left, their figures were spotted from above by Seth, who also overheard their conversation about the child. So when Veronica and Stathis arrived at the hospital and Veronica waited in the operating room, Seth appeared. He believed the child inside Veronica was the true Seth, and perhaps his only chance at salvation, so he immediately took Veronica back to the laboratory. Stathis, worried about Veronica's safety, soon followed with a shotgun, but his aim was terrible, and compared to Seth's strength, he was pitifully weak. In only a few moments, Seth had spat his enzyme onto Stathis, melting one of his hands and a leg. After making sure Stathis could not resist, Seth explained his plan to Veronica for turning back into a human. They would each enter a transmitter pod, be broken down by the computer, then recombined in the third unit, the receiver pod. That fusion, of course, would also include the child inside Veronica's body. Terrified, Veronica resisted, and in the struggle, she accidentally tore off Seth's jaw. At the same time, Seth's body rapidly transformed further into a flyman, his skin peeling away, revealing a terrifying insect-like creature. With a burst of force, he threw Veronica into the transmitter pod. As the countdown neared its end, he locked himself in another transmitter pod. But Stathis, still alive, used his remaining good hand to lift the shotgun and fired at the cables on the ground, severing the power to Veronica's transmitter pod, while Seth's pod and the receiver pod remained connected. Realizing what had happened, Seth smashed the glass door of the transmitter pod and tried to get out. But in the very moment he stepped out, the teleportation sequence began, breaking him down and recombining him in the receiver pod. This receiver pod was an older machine he had built, one that had been faulty and never used, but now, activated in desperation, it fused the flyman with the lifeless parts of the pod itself. Seth's body now had not only fly features but also grotesque lumps shaped like cables and metal. He realized he was beyond saving, and with the last trace of human thought, he begged Veronica to end his suffering. Though Veronica did not want to harm the man she loved, in the end, she pulled the trigger. As the deformed Seth's head exploded, the story of the fly came to an end. This sci-fi horror film, released in 1986, was actually adapted from a short story published decades earlier. This story had been adapted to the screen many times before, but none were as chilling and bizarre as the 1986 version. Unlike the subtle fusion of man and fly in the original story, the director boldly portrayed the complete transformation of a human into a fly, and even continued the tale with the offspring of a human and flyman. Of course, that part of the story would only appear in the sequel, The Fly 2.